This is Jason Harmon with uship.com. I'll be talking to you today about REST technologies and a little bit about what that means, as well as the RMM or Richardson Maturity Model and what it takes to get to level 2. So you might ask, what is REST? REST fundamentally is HTTP. Uh, Obviously, it's a little bit more than that. But really what I mean by that is that HTTP is the manner in which we conduct our web services. We utilize all the components of the HTTP spec to transfer state between our applications. So a little background on REST. A guy named Roy Fielding, pretty influential in the field, arguably the godfather of REST. He came out of UC Irvine and was the primary architect for HTTP 1.1, a big contributor to Apache HTTP, and not noted on this slide, also a big contributor to the URI spec for Uniform Resource Identifier, which we commonly use in REST. There's a few links here with the dissertation that Roy did back in 2001, which describes the concepts of REST, which only now, a little over 10 years later, we're still sort of exploring. In addition, there's another link here which walks through kind of Roy's perception on quite often people's misconceptions about what REST really is. So, looking at this Richardson maturity model, Martin Fowler first pulled together these ideas between another bright guy, Leonard Richardson, and some other folks who are authors of some great books like RESTful Web Services. And they put together this model, and the idea is at the bottom we've got the swamp of POCs, and the idea there is it's really plain old XML messages being passed around RPC style. And I like to say this area, which we commonly see in folks starting an API, sort of smells like soap, meaning it looks a lot like an old soap style call just put into an HTTP driven URL. Taking a step up from that, which is I think pretty common for organizations to get to, is the idea of resources, a URI which represents some sort of object, and we'll dive into that a little bit more later. However, HTTP verbs, and in my opinion, this is also where status codes come more heavily into play. These two areas are where we really start to feel the power of this model, and I think it often serves as a tough transitional state for organizations to step up their game and get closer to, as it says here, the glory of REST. Now, at level 3 is hypermedia controls, and I won't be diving into that much here, but that's probably something for a future topic. So, I mentioned URIs, and this is a way for us to describe our resources. Now, these all sound like big fancy terms, but you'll recognize these as stuff you put into your web browser, and it is the same thing. Again, we're using HTTP, the same thing that drives the web. However, as you see here, in a healthy API, we should have a variety of different ways to get to the objects that you're looking for. In this case, we might have a genre of information that we dive into to get a specific list of objects that are horror driven or year driven or author driven. So these are sort of a search mechanism in a sense. The most important thing when we're talking about getting something is that it's idempotent. So that kind of steps us into verbs and what that's all about. A get is really what we call when you put something into your web browser and you hit go. That's really creating a get operation in the HTTP parlance. So put is something that you don't typically do from your web browser, but it is actually a way that we can update a resource. Again, a resource being a particular URI, which represents some sort of object. Delete, pretty self-explanatory. We're deleting something. Although commonly this is some sort of soft delete in the backend system. Now a post is a little bit more open-ended, although certainly there's flexibility in all verbs. We see the most flexibility in post. In its simplest manner, this completes kind of the CRUD cycle and gives us a way to create something. So we'll create a resource by using post. However, we can do other things with post, such as actually in some cases updating a resource, but that can be a pretty specific case. but also things like complex searches, calculations, places where the parameter set is far too big to just describe in a URI or a query string. So we actually need to post some data to the server and then retrieve back those results. So in order to talk about any of these verbs, we really need to understand what status codes we should expect to see from the server. So as you can see here, having a little fun with HTTP status codes on 404s and 500s. These are things that you commonly see when you're browsing the web. What you don't see is things like the 201 status when you create something, or a 204 status when you perhaps put or delete something. There's also 200 actually, which we see in every successful get. We should be seeing a 200. So these are important mechanisms for, in the case of your web browsing, the web browser and the server to come to some consensus on what just happened on the operation, on the verb and URI that you specified. In this case, we're going to use it for our application communication. So when we step through the realities of what our get really looks like behind the scenes, we've got a get, we've got a URI, that's here, this some server book. The server is going to reply with a 200 OK and give us the content of that book. In this case, it's a JSON message or a JavaScript object notation, basically a JavaScript object, very common in most REST APIs these days. Again, it's idempotent. Repeat as often as you like. Of course, be nice to the server. Don't repeat so much that you bog somebody's system down. So HTTP put is taking things up a notch, where we're going to take that same data that we got and we're going to put it back. Using the put method, you notice here that this content is not coming back from the server. We're actually providing it to the server, and the server is going to reply to us, if it's exceeded, with 204, basically saying it's a 200 class error, or a 200 class status rather, which means it's exceeded, and there's no content, meaning, okay, I'm not going to tell you what you just put. There's no need for that. This actually avoids some scaling issues as we start looking at doing a lot of puts. We don't want to waste all the bandwidth of chattering back with the same thing that the client just gave us. We'll just tell them no content simply by replying with a 204. So with 3 digits, we can tell you exactly what happened, as long as nothing went wrong, of course. And again, in a put, we should also be idempotent, just like the get. So get and put tend to be pretty closely paired, in that the content should look about the same, and we should always have the goal of having them be idempotent so that we're not changing anything on the server. Now, there are also cases for HTTP put where we're actually going to create something. So you'll notice here the identifier for this ISBN 10 number. We have a sub-resource of preview. And because that's a named sub-resource, it implies that we know that this object already exists, this entity or resource in this big digit number over here. But we're really just going to create the preview sub-resource of that. So we're going to use the put to give us a way to put back data that looks something like it should if we were to do a get. And in this case, we'll get a 201 created, which you'll see in a moment looks more like the way that a post does. So I really only note this to remind you that put and post are sometimes a little bit flexible dependent on the scenario. You'll commonly hear people say that post is create, put is update. And I only point this out to show you that it's not necessarily always the case. So just be flexible in when you look at these verbs. So post, as I had already mentioned, you see the 201 created here again. We post to a particular resource. You'll note that there is no identifier because we don't know what it is that we're creating quite often. And in this case, I'm being a little bit cheeky by assuming that we're going to create an ISBN number. We probably all know it doesn't work that way. But for the sake of the example, we'll post some data without an identifier. The server will tell us it created it. And this is where it gets interesting. The server can give us a location header. The location header is typically used in 302 type scenarios, meaning a redirect. But in this case, it's not exactly a redirect. The server is just informing us, okay, I've created the resource that you asked for, and I've also given it this identifier and put it in the context of the correct URI. So something to keep in mind here Post is not idempotent. You are making things. So if you call post repetitively, thinking that you've done something good and let's do it some more, you may be eating up resources within your system by doing that. Uh, there are other cases for post. Again, like I talked about in the scope of the put, there are things like using a 202 instead of a 201, which implies that we're going to do some asynchronous processing in the background and then answer back in a little while. So we'll give you a status URL you can check on. But again, these are pretty complex scenarios. The basic gist is you're going to post some data to a base URL. You're going to receive a 201 in a location that tells you where that new resource lies. And finally, delete. Pretty simple. Deleting a specific resource, giving it an identifier, and you'll see it deleted as 204, the same as you did for put. We're not going to tell you much other than it succeeded. Good enough. And this is obviously not idempotent. If you call the delete verb on a resource more than once, if the first time was a 204, the second time should be a 404. 404, of course, meaning it no longer exists. We just deleted it. So, a quick review of status codes. You can see the 200 class here. These are all positive. These are good things just happen. So 200, okay. You see that on gets a lot. 201 for created after, let's say, a post, or as we saw in weird cases, a put. Or 204, no content after a put or update or a delete. 400, this is actually where the client did something wrong. He gave us some kind of bad data in his post or put or delete or whatever operation it was, where he's providing some content, and we want to warn him that there's something wrong. 404, pretty obvious. You asked for a resource that we do not have. 409, we typically see this when there are some sort of naming conflict, something like that. So if you have a unique name on a resource and you try to create a resource that already exists with that name, let's say trying to create a user account and that username already exists, 409 conflict, very appropriate use. And finally, 500, sorry client, you haven't done anything wrong. We messed up here. There's something wrong on the server, and no matter how many times you try, you're probably going to see the same thing, unless perhaps some environmental factor changes on the server. So, kind of high-level overview of commonly seen status codes that we would typically want to use as a base set. So that's kind of a quick overview of all of REST verbs and statuses. So what's next? Where do we go from here? As we look on the horizon, I think that there's not a broad level of support for what we call hypermedia, or some people have this horrible acronym, which we all love to try and pronounce. Hate OAS, HADIOS, I've heard it said many ways. It's basically hypermedia, I think is a classier way to say it. As you can see here, we've got resources linking themselves together. And it's the concept that as part of our response in a GET, or any other resource, we provide links to what kind of things you can do with this resource, or if it has sub-resources, or even a link to itself. All of these can be very useful, especially when we start distributing the data that's returned by this RESTful API into other systems which sort of store the linked data. So whether that be XML or JSON, if you provide links within there and you store that data intact, later on you can go back and say, where did this come from, and actually look at a self-link. So again, this is just a very brief mention that these are future concepts which I think are being explored more deeply in a lot of different server platforms and by a lot of organizations, certainly myself included in my current endeavors with UShip. So this is something that we'll talk about in a future screencast, and for now, that is all. So thanks for watching.